Welcome to the Growing in Love for Life podcast, where it's all about saving and strengthening your marriage and creating the relationship you really deserve and want to have. And now, from growinginloveforlife.com, relationship and marriage coach and best-selling author, your host, Liam Naden.
This is episode 14 of the Growing in Love for Life podcast. Hello everyone, it's Liam Naden here again. Welcome back to this episode of the podcast, and today we're going to talk about something that is one of the most critical foundations to a great marriage. And if you've listened to any of my previous podcasts or read any of my books, you'll know that one of the things I talk a lot about is the structure of a marriage or a relationship, and how if problems are developing, it's usually a sign that something in the foundations or the structure is not right. In other words, how the marriage is actually put together is not correct. And problems, if you have them, are really just the symptoms of a much deeper issue. And one of the most vital things to have as a foundation for a great marriage or relationship is complete, total, and unhesitating honesty. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about honesty and how do you create real honesty in your marriage. And not only that, but what is honesty? Why is it so important? And how do you actually know if you are in a totally honest relationship? But I'm going to give you some tools and ideas here to help you to create more real honesty in your marriage. Okay, well, let's start by talking a little bit about what honesty actually is. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what do you mean? It's obvious. I mean, it's something that we all learned as children, wasn't it? That honesty is about telling the truth and not telling lies. Well, while that's true, I think that it has a much deeper meaning and a more powerful meaning in a relationship. And it's something that's vital to understand if you really want to create a fantastically fulfilling marriage. So my definition of honesty in a marriage is that it's two people living their true and authentic selves without fear of the consequences, and unconditionally allowing the other person to do the same. So I'll just repeat that. True honesty in a marriage is two people living their true and authentic selves without fear of the consequences, and unconditionally allowing the other person to do the same. So now there's some quite important points here about this definition. First and foremost, about being honest with yourself. You know, are you living your authentic life? Are you being who you really are? Are you letting, if you like, your light shine, and are you giving the most to the world? And you can only do that if you're being totally honest with yourself. Now, if you think about some of the great leaders or charismatic people, people that you really admire, what distinguishes them from the rest of us? And I think one of the reasons we're so attracted to those people is that usually they're living their own true life. And so irrespective of any criticism or negative reactions they might get from others, they're being themselves and they're happy to be themselves. In other words, they're being honest with themselves. The second thing about my definition, of course, is that I mentioned without fear of the consequences. And not having fear in a relationship is not only very, very critical, but it's also very rare. Because so much of what holds us back in our life and in our relationship is based on our fears. You know, fear of the consequences, fear of what we think might happen, fear of being criticized or being hurt or even of making mistakes. So we've got to get to a place where there is no fear for real honesty to start happening. And the other point about my definition is that I said it's unconditionally allowing the other person to do the same. So this means not only being yourself, but allowing your spouse to be themselves as well. You know, for them to be able to make their own mistakes, for them to say and do what is true to them without you being offended by it or hurt by it. Think for a moment, can you imagine being in your marriage and being able to say and do anything you wanted? Now, of course, without intentionally wanting to hurt your spouse. That's very important. But if you didn't intentionally want to hurt them, you were able to do or say anything and know that you would never be judged for that. I mean, if you could live your life like that, you could just focus on developing yourself to show the real you to the world. And can you imagine what a difference that would make, not only to yourself, but to everyone else around you as well? It would make a hugely positive difference. And again, if you're not sure what a feeling, or if you're not sure how that would actually look like for you, just think of anyone you might know, or a charismatic person, or someone you really admire. And as I say, chances are they're probably living that truth to themselves and not feeling that they're going to be criticized or to hurt someone else. Now, just before we move on, I also want to make the point that if you're in a marriage where your spouse is not being totally honest with you, and maybe you're hurt by that, and maybe you're listening to this wondering how do you deal with that. You want to be honest, you want them to be honest with you, but you can't get them to be honest with you. Well, the place to start, even in that situation, is yourself. And you need to start asking yourself some honest questions, such as, why do you think they're not being honest with you? And are they able to express their feelings to you with what we said, without fear of the consequences? Can they tell you how they feel without fear of any consequences? And are you living your true and authentic self without fearing any consequences and unconditionally allowing them to do the same? So we're going to talk about these things later in the podcast, and I'm going to give you some ideas. So it's whether you don't feel you can be honest with your spouse, or whether you feel they're not being honest with you. Some of the things I'm going to talk to you about in this podcast I think will really help. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to ask you a few questions, and primarily what I'm trying to say is, how honest are you in your marriage or relationship? How honest are you really being? Maybe you don't know the depth of honesty that you can really achieve in a marriage and a relationship. And think about these questions I'm going to ask you, and they're going to give you some insights into how honest a relationship you actually have with your spouse. So here's the first thing to think about. First question, are you able to share every thought you ever have with your spouse? So have you ever been in a situation, or are you in a constant situation where no matter what you're thinking, you feel that you're able to share that thought with your spouse? Or put another way, and here's the second question, are there any thoughts or feelings that you have had that you haven't been able or willing to share with your spouse? Anything at all, big or small? It's the next question to ask yourself. Here's question number 3. If your spouse asks you, what are you doing, or what are you thinking, are you always able to be totally honest with them? If they've ever come up to you and said, what are you doing at the moment? Or what are you thinking? Can you say truthfully that you've always been able to tell them honestly what you were doing or thinking? Next question, have you ever not said something to your spouse because you thought that if you did, you would hurt their feelings? Now remember, being totally honest isn't just about telling the truth. It's about being able to say what you feel in any moment. So is there ever anything that you haven't said because you thought it would hurt their feelings? Now here's question number 5. And this is a pretty interesting one. Think of a sexual fantasy you've had more than once. And just a thing on sexual fantasies, I mean, it's totally normal to have fantasies. Everyone has them. There's nothing weird or strange. They're totally normal. So we'll get that one out of the way. Now, so think of a sexual fantasy that you have had, and be honest with yourself here. Remember, this is the first stage to being honest in a relationship, is being honest with yourself. So I'm asking you to be honest in answering these questions, and because they only are for your benefit anyway. So answer this question honestly. Think of a sexual fantasy you've had more than once. Maybe it's a recurring one, or just something you've thought about a couple of times. Would you be able to tell your spouse about your fantasy? Would you be able to say to them, this is my fantasy, and would you be able to describe it in great detail to them without getting embarrassed or being hesitant? Could you do that? Really interesting question to answer. So I think those questions, if you're honest with yourself and really think about them, they're going to give you a lot of insight into how honest you are in your relationship and how honest your relationship is in general. But if you feel uncomfortable or bad about what you answered, don't. Don't feel bad. It's far more important that you're honest with yourself. And the truth is, there are very, very few marriages, I think, that have complete and total honesty, so you're certainly not alone. And what we're talking about here, of course, is an ideal to work to. So the fact that very few people have got there, if you like, doesn't mean it's not a worthy ideal to have. But don't feel bad if you think of all of the gaps in your own honesty in your relationship. The first step is to identify them and see how honest you actually are. And as we get further into the podcast, of course, I'm going to give you some ideas of things you can do that are going to be able to significantly increase the amount of honesty you can get in your marriage. But you need to know where you are to start with, where you are right now. But let's be clear, there are some very significant consequences of not living in a totally honest relationship. And maybe you can relate to some of these things. So this is what tends to happen in relationships that aren't based on total honesty. Firstly, there are big consequences for you yourself. It's easy to get frustrated because you have these feelings that you're not able to really be yourself. You're not able to express yourself because you're concerned what the other person might think. And that can lead to feeling a lack of fulfillment and ultimately a lack of happiness, because you're never going to be able to be happy, truly happy, until you can pursue and get what you really need and really want. What you really need and really want. Not based on what anyone else needs and wants. You've got to be true to yourself. And if you're not, you'll never be happy and fulfilled. And you'll never be able to truly give to other people, including your spouse. The second thing is, if you're not in a totally honest relationship, it has consequences for your spouse as well. And they're probably also going to be frustrated. They're probably going to be confused as well. There's probably going to be a lot of miscommunication between you if you can't say what you're honestly thinking or feeling or what do you want to do. And sometimes what we see too is people lose respect for their spouse. When they see their spouse isn't being honest with them, they lose respect for them and they think, well, why can't they just be honest? Why can't they have the courage to be honest and to be themselves? So that's the second thing. And there are also negative consequences on your relationship. And if you're not in a totally honest relationship, things like the intimacy are really going to be significantly and negatively affected. It's very difficult to reach the level of intimacy with someone if you're not in a totally honest relationship with them. You can't let yourself go and be yourself. And the whole thing of shared growth is going to be lacking in your relationship. And I think this is such a key element, another key element, we can talk about this in another podcast, for a marriage, is to share in your growth, to share in your development as people. And one of the keys to growth, of course, in life is to make mistakes and learn from them. And if you don't feel that you are able to do that, that you don't feel able to make mistakes, and therefore you can't be totally honest with yourself about what you want and how you feel, then you're never going to reach your potential. So all of those things are negative consequences of not being in an honest relationship. Now, if you contrast this with the rewards of being in a totally honest relationship, I think you're going to find it is just so worth trying to achieve this. Because remember our definition of, I'll just remind you of our definition of total honesty in a marriage. It's two people living their true and authentic selves without fear of the consequences and unconditionally allowing the other person to do the same. So that means if you're in a relationship like that, what are the sort of things that are going to happen? Well, firstly, you're going to be able to find out what really makes you happy. And the only way to know what makes you happy is to try some different things. Try some new things. Try something. See if you like it. And so you're going to be able to do that if you know that if you make a mistake, it's not going to be the end of the world, but the person is able to accept that you've made a mistake. And that whole feeling of, when you're in a totally honest relationship, of being able to make mistakes and being able to move on from those mistakes without any feelings or resentment or hurt or your spouse feeling upset or criticism or accusation, if none of that's there, and that all you move on from a mistake is a feeling that you're grateful that you've learned from the mistake and your spouse is happy that you've learned from the mistake, that's another huge benefit and a huge reward of being in a totally honest marriage. another huge benefit, maybe the biggest one, is the feeling you get of unconditional love and intimacy. I mean, to know that there's someone there who loves you so much that they are willing to accept anything you say and do merely as where you are at that moment. For them to accept that and to accept that you're only trying to discover who you are, and you're supporting them in discovering who they are. And you're not trying to hurt them, but you're just expressing yourself how you feel in that moment. That's an amazing place to be in a marriage. And that leads to incredible feelings of trust and intimacy. And having a relationship where there's no criticism, no ill feeling, no resentment, just a place where the two of you are happy to be together and you support each other. That's an amazing benefit of a totally honest relationship. And in my view, this is something amazing that everybody in a marriage or relationship should really aspire to, because the rewards and the benefits are just so worth it. All right, well, all that sounds great, so how do you achieve it? How do you create real honesty in your marriage? And especially if maybe you or your spouse haven't been particularly honest with each other in the past, or if one of you has done things to make it very difficult to feel that you can be honest with the other. Perhaps you or your spouse might have betrayed trust in some way. The obvious one is having an affair, or doing something very hurtful behind one or other of your back. So what I've done is I've come up with a list of 6 things that you can do that are going to significantly increase the amount of honesty and therefore intimacy, happiness and joy in your marriage. So these are the 6 things. Alright, the first one is to be honest with yourself about what you want. Now, in so much of what I've talked about in previous podcasts and all of the material I've done, and certainly in the private coaching program I do with people, it really does come back so much to yourself, your relationship with yourself. And I know I've said this in the past, that the relationship you have with your spouse is very much a reflection of the relationship that you have with yourself. So the first thing you need to do is you've got to be honest with yourself about what you want. So what I mean by this is, for an example, is to think about an area of your marriage and your life that you're not happy about, where maybe you'd like to be doing something different or thinking something different. Think of something that you're not happy about. Perhaps you'd like to travel, or maybe you'd like to try to have a different career path, or you want to spend more time alone perhaps, or you want to take up a new hobby. But think of something that when you do think about it, you tend to push it out of your mind because you don't think you can have it. And you think, well, maybe my spouse won't approve, or it's a bit risky, or they won't like what I'm doing, or whatever. And I want you to look at that, and I want you to ask yourself, what do I really want here? If there was a crystal ball and life was perfect and I could have this, what do I really want? And get clear on what it is you really want. If you want to travel, where do you want to travel to? How often do you want to travel? What sort of travel do you want to do? If you want to do something, a different hobby or a different career, what do you want to do? Get really clear. And you don't have to be clear to the point of not being afraid of making a mistake, because you might try it and decide it's not for you. But the first thing is to say, no, what can I think of right now that I would like to do that I don't feel I can do? Because my spouse wouldn't approve, or I don't feel comfortable about revealing that it's something I want to do. So get clear about it. And then the next thing is to accept that it is really something you're supposed to do, because you wouldn't want to do it if you weren't supposed to at least give it a try. At least look into it. Take the first step. So this is the first thing you've got to do. If you want to develop honesty in your relationship with your spouse, and if you want them to be honest with you, as well as you be honest with them, you've got to start being honest with yourself about what you really want. And don't make apologies for that. And don't say, oh, well, it's being selfish, or they don't want it, or anything like that. You've got to be really honest with yourself about what you want. Okay, so the second step is to consider the consequences of total honesty. Now, the way you could do this, you could take one of the things you've identified from the previous step, something that you want, or you could even look at a feeling or a thought that you've had that you haven't felt you've been able to express or to talk about with your spouse. And ask yourself this question. So identify the thing that you haven't been able to do or express, and say, if I was to tell my spouse what I think or feel about this, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, what is the worst thing that could happen? Well, you might think, well, they'd get upset. Okay, well, they would get upset. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But if they get upset, well, obviously they're going to have to deal with that, aren't they? And the chances are they will probably get over it, either quickly or not so quickly, but they will get over it. I mean, what's the worst could happen is that they'll get upset. I mean, is it going to be, I don't think so, but I don't think it's going to be they're going to throw you out of the house or burn the house down or stop letting you eat for a week or do something really fatal. What's the worst thing? Usually it's just that you think they're going to get upset, but people get over being upset. And usually the worst thing that can happen either isn't that bad anyway, or it's never going to happen. But these are the things you fear, which are stopping you from expressing what you want and how you're feeling. So that's the first thing. So what's the worst thing that could happen? And the other side of the consequences, of course, is say, well, if I was to tell my spouse what I think or feel about this, what's the best thing that could happen? I mean, maybe they'd say something like, and this happens all the time, they might say, well, it's funny you should say that because I've been thinking exactly the same thing, but I was too scared to mention it because I didn't know how you would react. And what's the great thing about that? Well, not only do you create honesty between the two of you, but you actually get what you want anyway, and you do it in a loving and supportive way and make it a fun experience for the two of you. Now, I see to give you an example of this, and I was recently talking to a couple and they had this whole issue of honesty, and they were both frustrated because they weren't really getting what they wanted, but they didn't feel they could communicate with each other. And I had them do a little bit of an exercise, and it was based on a lot of material that I cover in the private coaching program. So there were some tools there that helped them. But what came out of it was the husband said, well, there's one thing I've actually always wanted to do. I've always wanted to go to a nude beach. And he looked a bit embarrassed about it. It took a while to get it out of him. This is what he wanted to do. And he said, I've always liked the thought of sunbathing naked by the beach and just skinny dipping. I loved doing it when I was a kid, and something I'd like to do. And he looked a bit embarrassed, and his wife said, well, it's funny you should say that because I'd really like to do that as well. I thought about mentioning it. I've thought of it a few times, but I was a bit embarrassed, and I thought you would think I was stupid. So that's just an example of what happens. The best thing could be, the best consequence of being totally honest with your partner or your spouse is that you get what you want anyway, and in a wonderful way, and in sharing it with them. So it's the second thing, is really consider the positive and negative consequences of total honesty. Step number 3 is to create an environment of trust in your relationship. So that means a couple of things. Firstly, resolve never to make your spouse feel bad about what they say or do. In other words, don't judge them for their thoughts or feelings. Resolve that those are their thoughts and feelings at the time. They're entitled to those. They're human, and you're never going to make them feel bad about it. And the other thing is, allow them to make mistakes. And in fact, if you're listening to this podcast with your spouse, or you're able to share this information with them, it's a great thing to do together, is to say, let's both agree we'll allow each other to make mistakes, and say, you can do, think, or say anything you like as long as you're not doing it intentionally to hurt me. So that's about creating an environment of trust between the two of you. Okay, step number 4 comes back to you again. It's take responsibility for your own feelings. So this means never blaming your spouse for how you feel, and realize that how you feel is actually your responsibility. And if you do feel hurt by something your spouse does, and this is a really big thing, but if you do feel hurt by them, what you have to realize that it's not what they've done or said that's hurt you, but it's the meaning that you've attached to it. And this is a huge realization that very, very few people have. But once you realize it, it can change your life. That it's not what somebody else does, it's how you feel about it. It's the meaning that you've given to it, the belief you have about it, that makes you feel hurt. And it requires you to have to do a little bit of work on yourself and think, well, what meaning am I giving to that that's making me feel hurt? But that's about taking responsibility for your own feelings, and it's absolutely critical. And step number 5, on the other hand, is to insist your spouse takes responsibility for their feelings. So this means not feeling guilty. And here's a great phrase, I've used this before, and I love this one. You worry about how you feel, and I'll worry about how I feel. Okay? Have that agreement. So sometimes this is not going to be easy. Your spouse is probably going to get really upset with you, but you need to insist, in your own mind at least, that they take responsibility for their feelings, just as you are taking responsibility for your feelings. Alright, and the final step, step number 6, is you've got to agree to make total honesty a habit. Now, so in other words, what is a habit? A habit is just something you do without even having to think about it. So you've got to make total honesty a habit. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. The first way is to look for small ways to practice being totally honest. So maybe look for small things where you wouldn't feel that comfortable about telling your spouse, just little things, but you practice it. Just try telling them and getting into that feeling of just being totally honest. And that's the other side of the next thing about making total honesty a habit, which is to focus on the action of honesty, not the consequence. Focus on the action of being honest, not the consequence. So when you want to say or do something with total honesty, don't think about what might happen or might not happen because of you being honest, but just focus on being totally honest. Go into yourself and say, am I being totally honest? Is this a chance for me to practice being totally honest right here? And just do it. And you'll find, like any other habit, it's going to take a bit of practice, but after a while, you'll just get in, you won't even think about it. Your whole mindset will be, I am totally honest in our relationship. That's just the way it is. And if there are any consequences of that, if the other person has feelings about that, well, that's something that they've got to deal with. Now, those 6 steps, I think if you can try those things, think about them, about how you can integrate them into your marriage, into your relationship, they can make a huge difference. I've talked about the benefits of having total honesty in your marriage or in your relationship, but it is absolutely incredible. To have a relationship where you can just be yourself and know you're supported to be yourself. I mean, that's really what unconditional love is. We talk about unconditional love in a marriage, but very, very few people actually practice it. But if you can get to the place where you have totally unconditional love and total honesty, it's an amazing place to be. So, make a commitment to aim for total honesty in your marriage, because the benefits far outweigh any sort of negatives. In fact, there aren't really any negatives. And if you're wondering about, can I really do this? Is it going to be too hard? Is it worth it? Well, one thing I think it's worth considering is think about your children. And imagine if they were in a relationship, you'd want them to be as happy as they could be, wouldn't you? And I think you'd agree you'd also want them, or you want them, to be who they really are and to really express their own self to the world, and not to have any fears or worry about what other people think, and not to be in a relationship where they can't be honest and be free to be themselves. So if you want that for your children, which I know you do if you have children, why not give it to yourself? And not only that, why not be an example to your children as well? So that imagine them coming to you and saying, I admire you for the honesty in your marriage, or what are you going to say to them if they ask you, are you really honest with your spouse? So think about your children. If you've got any doubts about the importance or your ability to try this at least, it really is important. So we've run out of time as usual. I've thrown a lot at you here again, but I hope you found this useful. I hope you can pick up some ideas here that you can use and try them and see the result that you get. And develop in your marriage that wonderful feeling that true honesty really gives you. So thanks for taking the time to be here with me and to listen to this. If if you'd like some more information, again, if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you to download my free report, The 5 Keys to Saving Your Marriage Now, which I think you'll find really helpful. And that's at my website, growinginloveforlife.com. And if you feel like sending me a comment or a question, I'd love to hear from you. You're very welcome to drop me a line by email, and my email is Liam, Liam, at growinginloveforlife.com. So that's all until next time, and bye for now.